Okay, I want to spend some time on the walkthrough this morning and add some things. Here's our basic map, basic layout, and fortunately in this room that is basically north. So this room sits a little skewed, and I never know. Well, yeah, that's basically north. So we're not totally turned around. And as we would be looking at what we today would call the Middle East, we see the western edge of the Mediterranean Sea. We see the top of what is today called the Persian Gulf. By the way, the Mediterranean Sea then was called the Great Sea, as I recall. It wasn't called the Mediterranean. Those are present names. Ancient Mesopotamia, or you may have studied it as the Fertile Crescent. And it's that area that goes up around the Tigris Euphrates and then comes down around into the land of Canaan. Why do they deal with it as a crescent? Remember? Huh? The what? Yeah, that's what a crescent means. But why isn't it just the whole area from across there? Because the middle's all desert. Okay. So you don't go from, Ur straight across to Canaan. You only get a few miles, and then you die in the sand. Back then, anyway. So you always traveled up, and that's why Abraham, to get from Ur, which clear down there toward the Persian Gulf, went up to Haran. From Ur up to Haran and then down into Canaan, because this was not traversable. And so this is that whole area. And you've got your great world powers through various periods up here, Babylon, Nineveh. Later you've got Greece, you've got Rome. They're all to the north. And then the other great power was Egypt. And look what's right in the middle. All these powers to get at each other. And all of the commercial traffic and everything had to go right through this tiny, little, insignificant land which God gave to Abraham and his descendants. And that's on purpose. And he didn't put any oil there. There's oil everywhere around that area except in Canaan. And just God arranged all of this to work out His purposes. And that's what we will unfold in this course. And so it helps to be aware of the geography and where the movement is and some of the distances. Anybody know what the distance is from Ur to Haran? Haran? Huh? 3,000? No, that's too much. Yeah, it's more like 600 miles. Yeah. I did a map once in North America illustrating this. It would sort of be like, I can't remember now what I used, Chicago to Winnipeg or Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, and then down to Kansas City or Oklahoma City or something like that. I mean, it's a pretty big spread. So some fair distances here, especially with travel then. Okay, so we need to be aware of the geography. You have this page in your notes, and this page helps you understand how the books of the Bible fit together chronologically, because the layout of your English Bibles does not give you a whole lot of help in that regard. It does for a while, like until you get to Ezra and Nehemiah. That's pretty much chronological up to that point. But then from then on, the books fit back in there somewhere. And so this chart will help you, and one of the things that you will do on the first test is write out the 11 historical books. That is, the main books from which we get all of the walkthrough material, all of this history that we've been putting together, which we'll review in a moment. And so you've got Genesis, Exodus, Why am I skipping Leviticus? Because Leviticus is full of the way they are to worship and what the priests are to do. It's Numbers that picks up the history. Then you've got Joshua and Judges. Now Ruth is put in there because it says it happened in the time of the Judges, but Ruth really doesn't give us history. And then you've got 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and then down here at the bottom, underneath the Babylonian captivity, Ezra and Nehemiah. And you have those numbered in your handout. I've changed that, right? And you've got how many books? 11. And so I want you to learn the order. Those are the 11 historical books. Every other book of the Bible fits into one of those periods. And it's really pretty easy to arrange the rest of them. You have wisdom and other books like Job and Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Ruth and Psalms and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Lamentations, and Esther. That leaves the prophetic books. So these are wisdom writings and other types of writings. And notice I've got Job right up there at the beginning with Genesis. It's found in the poetic literature with Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon because that's the type of literature that it is. It's the genre. But historically, it appears to fit in terms of the background and the culture and so forth very early, patriarchal period. Abraham and Isaac and that bunch. Leviticus, of course, is the law that's given to him at Mount Sinai, and Exodus covers that. Numbers, Deuteronomy is Moses preaching in Moab, and Numbers is the historical book that we have that in. Ruth, I said, fits with Judges. Now, some of the Psalms are early. There's Psalms of Moses, and there are Psalms later than David, but we put them there because, generally speaking, the Psalms are associated with David. He, by far, authored the most Psalms of an individual. And Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon are all associated with Solomon. Good, you're awake. And so they will fit in there. Again, some Proverbs, you have some other materials in it. 1st and 2nd Chronicles basically covers the first material of 1st and 2nd Kings, except actually it goes all the way back to Adam. And yet it's written from a different standpoint. It's not as historically concerned as 1st and 2nd Kings. It's more addressing this period from a certain thematic element, from a certain design, a certain purpose. Lamentations is associated with Jeremiah, and that's why it's there. And then Esther fits in the period of Nehemiah. So once you learn the 11 historical books, and you learn where the other books, who they're associated with and so forth, you can then know, when you're in the Bible, where you are historically and what is the context, where things fit. Then what we have are the prophets. And again, second semester, when we get to the prophets, we're going to take them in this order. We're not going to take them in the order we find them in our English Bibles, because we don't know why that order is there in some cases. And so we're going to take them in order of when the prophecies occurred, the context. Now, some of them, we have a couple of choices. The smaller ones, like Obadiah and so forth. But basically, you've got prophets to Jonah's to Nineveh, Obadiah's to Edom, and you've got 3 to the northern kingdom. That's where it's helpful to know that the kingdom has split, isn't it? And you get into the prophets, and you're reading about Israel, Judah, and all of a sudden all you're doing is reading about Judah. And then back to reading about Israel, Judah, because the prophets aren't arranged chronologically in our English Bibles. So this course, we're going to cover things chronologically so that you have the best chance of seeing how it all fits together and what each of these kinds of literature and what each of the books contributes to the story of the Old Testament, to what God is trying to communicate in it. We've got the Assyrian captivity, and then that leaves us with just Judah. So Micah, Isaiah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, are all prophets from the Assyrian captivity until the Babylonian captivity. Daniel and Ezekiel are the two prophets that ministered during the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah is just before and slides into it. And then you've got three post-captivity prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So if you just, kind of think of the Babylonian captivity as, a football goalpost. And you're standing on the field looking at this goalpost. And the Babylonian captivity is the goalpost. You got two prophets sitting on the goalpost, the crossbar. Who are they? Daniel and Ezekiel, all right? And if you're going chronologically from left to right, because that's how we think, left to right, Hebrews thought right to left, because that's how Hebrew is written. I don't know how they thought. Anyway, we think of time going this way. If you draw a timeline, you always start with the oldest on the left, don't you? So on the right of the goalpost, you've got three prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and all the rest are on the left, with Jeremiah leaning against left upright. So if you just kind of draw that silly little picture in your head, you've got, a third of the prophets in right chronological order. And then you think about the Assyrian captivity, and they begin to fall into place. Toward the end of the semester, I guess that's second semester, I'll actually give you this chart with blanks and say what goes here. So, you'll learn it, you'll be familiar with it. And so what we're doing with the walkthrough is doing a historical skeleton on the basis of the 11 historical books. And we will start reviewing, what book we're in when we're at a certain place in our walkthrough as we walk around the room. And then you will know how to fit the rest of them in. So, it's important to know that, things, God has worked in history. God isn't subject to time. God is outside of time. But He has worked in time because we are limited to time. And so He is progressing. He's moving toward an end, and He sets things up. In Galatians it says, in the fullness of time, God brought forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, that He might redeem those who are under the curse of the law. And so for us, God's purposes are laid out in a time sequence. And we see things building, and we see things being prepared, and we see things, coming to fruition. We see Him predicting things, and then those things happening. And on the basis of that, some other things being expected to happen. And so it's important that as we study the Old Testament, we study it with a sense of the time and a sense of the movement. And there's great drama in that. There's some mystery in that. There's anticipation. How many of you read mystery novels backwards? Some people you just can't stand not to know. So you read the end first to see who done it. Is that what you do, Tiffany? Yeah. But they're meant to be read, with the situation and how's this going to work out and who did it, and you get into it and you're just drawn on. And that's what we find in God's working in history. And as we read the Bible, as we read the Old Testament in the chronological order, we catch and see how this works, and we see this anticipation. Now, in some regards, we're at a disadvantage because we've already read the end. As the church, living with the New Testament, with the completed Revelation, knowing, how it's going to turn out. And so we doubtless don't read the Old Testament with as much excitement as somebody who wouldn't know the whole story and would sit down and begin reading it. Anybody in that situation? Of course, probably none of you have really ever read the Old Testament chronologically. But, as it's new and it just... and so putting it together chronologically gives us the best chance of capturing some of that drama and anticipation and just seeing how God works and how God prepares and how He calls people to see what He's doing and to by faith count upon Him working it all out, as he has said. And so what we're seeing in Genesis and what we're going to see in Genesis are the seeds, the beginnings, the anticipation, and then see how it builds all the way through. Of course, centered in Christ and the great promises about Him. And that's certainly one of the great themes that we will trace. So this is what we're working with, and you will want to refer back to that. Let's see. I want to look at something else here. No, I don't have it here. You do have a page of your notes in that introductory material, which I don't know where it is. The Hebrew canon. It's right after this book's chronologically that we just looked at. You've got the Hebrew canon. Now you notice there's a different kind of a layout. The Hebrew Bible, by the way, our English Bibles are based upon the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament done a couple of hundred years before Christ. But you've got Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, or law. You've got prophets, and notice what they call prophets. Joshua, Judges, Samuels, and Kings are the former prophets. Well, that's a little different, isn't it? So they got a little bit of different definition of a prophet going on there than we do. And then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 as the former and latter prophets. So that's how the Hebrew Bible was arranged. And then you've got the writings divided into poetry, the feast rolls, and histories. Poetry, Job, Psalms, Proverbs. The feast rolls, and these are books that became associated with various celebrations and feasts of Israel. The Passover, Pentecost, the destruction of the temple, tabernacles, and Purim. Not all of those are biblical observances, but of course the Passover, Pentecost are. And then histories. And notice who they put in histories. Daniel. Whoa, wait a minute. I thought Daniel was a prophet. In our Bibles, English Bibles, he's in with the major prophets, isn't he? But for some reason, the Hebrew Bible classifies him as a history with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. And so there's a certain scheme of arrangement working with that. So just be aware that we have different arrangements of the canon of Scripture between the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, our English Bibles. And we're not following any of them. Okay? We're going to try and put it together chronologically. And so just be referring back to those charts, and that will help you. Okay, let's review the walkthrough. I want to have a good review of the walkthrough here today, and then we'll get into Genesis, finish up the first part of Genesis on Monday. Okay, we start at what date? 0? 0 is the birth of Christ. Now, Bishop Ussher said 4004 BC. I don't think that's probably an accurate date, because I think we probably have written records now that go back beyond that. We don't know what the date is, okay? And I'm not going to argue a date for creation. The young earth view would say, I don't know, 7,000 to 10,000 years BC, or 10,000 years ago. I don't know. We're not going to worry about it, okay? It began. I'm not going to worry about it. God knows when it began. Okay, we started some date with creation, fall, flood, rainbow, Tower of Babel, scattering. Okay, good. And that brings us to Genesis 11 and 12 in the city of Ur with Abraham, Sarah, Terah, and Lot. Terah being Abraham's father. They travel up the Euphrates River, which is the bottom river. The Tigris is on top. they travel up to Haran, where Terah dies. So you've got Abraham, Sarah, Lot. They are told to go to a land, the land of Canaan. Now, I'm going to have you learn 6 points that will help you kind of keep in mind what it was that God was promising to Abraham. Of course, the first is land. He's promising him land. The second thing that he promises Abraham, and we'll look at this in a few days, the Abrahamic covenant, is descendants, or the biblical word is seed. All right? Land and seed. And this is in the context of an overarching promise, and that is that he will bless Abraham. And that through Abraham, he will bless all the families of the earth. So, to Abraham, God promised what? Land, seed, blessing. Now, we're going to make the point and show you in Scripture that this land was real land. Okay? We know it because he gave him boundaries, he told him to walk around in it, and so forth. And so it was a literal promise. All right? And he said, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. So it was an eternal promise. And he said, I will give it to you. So it was an unconditional promise. So let's start learning those 6 points. Land, seed, say it with me, blessing. He promised it literal, eternally, unconditionally. Say it again. Land, seed, blessing, literal, eternal, unconditional. Those 6 things really help us understand what it is that God was doing with Abraham. And we'll fill that out in your notes in a few days. Okay, so who dies at Haran? Terah. So we've got Abraham, Sarah, Lot. They come down to the land of Canaan. What are the 6 things? Land, seed, blessing, literal, eternal, unconditional. So they come down to the land of Canaan. All right? Abraham has 4 eyes. 2 eyes in his head, 2 eyes in his house. Both his sons' names start with the letter I. He has Isaac and Ishmael. By the way, who was born first? Why did I say Isaac first? Because he was the son of promise. You know, Abraham probably wasn't born first either. I think Abraham was the baby. So anyway. So you got Isaac, Ishmael. Isaac has 2 sons. There's a J, Jacob, and E for Esau. Jacob has 12 sons and daughter Dinah. Okay? Youngest son, Benjamin. Next youngest, and Joseph is sold into slavery into Egypt, where he becomes a big wheel. What book of the Bible are we in? What historical book? Still in Genesis, all right? So the story of Joseph is Genesis 37, 38, 39, down in through the rest of that. Meanwhile, back in Canaan, famine. The rest of the family come down through the whole story of his brothers coming to buy grain and so forth, and settle there. They're there for 400 years in bondage. God has a very specific purpose for bringing them down there. God raises up a deliverer, Moses. What book are we in? Exodus. Now we're in Exodus, 400 years later. They exit from the land. That's really clever, isn't it? Wow. Okay, Moses leads them across Red Sea to Mount Sinai, where we get Torah, laws and regulations and customs and everything that they would need to know to live in the Promised Land. What historical book are we in? We're still in Exodus. Historical book is Exodus, all right? They get the law. They're here, it's 2 years total almost from the time they come out of Egypt till they leave for Kadesh Barnea. So they're at Mount Sinai receiving the law. Leviticus takes place here, but it's not a historical book, is it? Okay. They're ready to leave Mount Sinai to go to where? No. They're ready to leave to go to the land They stop at Kadesh Barnea, all right? So they stop at Kadesh Barnea on their way to the land and send out 12 spies. So the spies come down, they look around the land of Canaan, they come back. 10 say, shouldn't go in, they'll kill us. 2 say, yes. Anybody know who they were? Joshua and Caleb. And those are the only 2 out of the first generation that entered the promised land. So, result of disobedience, judgment, they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. What book are we in historically? Numbers. How are we going to remember that? Well, no. You could have 40, but we got 70 over there and 400 over there, so that's not a reliable way to remember it. Well, the reason it's called Numbers is that they took a census twice. Once at the beginning of the wilderness wandering and once at the end. Now, you can debate on whether you call that censuses or censi, but they took 2 of them. All right? One at the beginning and one at the end. And the people who refused to go into the land, they said, you know what's going to happen? We're going to, and they're going to kill our children and our wives and just, they'll just destroy us. What we find is that the census at the end, there is a little more people than there were at the beginning when that first generation had died. So they were operating on sight instead of faith, and they're the ones that died in the wilderness. And their children go in and conquer the land. So the book of Numbers is that whole period of wilderness wandering. Numbers 10 is when they actually leave Mount Sinai. All right, so that's how long? 40 years wandering. Moses brings them up to Moab. And Moses preaches, dies. And the essence or the preaching, what we have of it, is the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is not a historical book. It's the record of God giving to the second generation the law in an expanded form as they're ready to go into the land. So Moses dies. Next leader, Joshua, leads them across the Jordan River at flood time. They are on a military expedition, and their first objective is Jericho. They walk around Jericho, they blow their trumpets as God commanded, and the walls fall down. What book are we in? That's pretty easy. Good. Joshua, all right? Their next objective is Ai, the A. They conquer Ai, drive a wedge in the land, conquer in the south, conquer in the north, divide the land up between the 12 tribes. What historical book are we in? We're still in Joshua. Joshua is the period of the conquest. And so it's the military victories. It's dividing the land between the tribes. That's all Joshua. The next period is one of chaos and a downward spiral, and it is the book of Judges. And that brings us to the last judge and the first prophet, who is called Samuel, all right? Little Sammy. And this begins then the period of the kings. The first king of Israel is Saul. Samuel anoints Saul. Saul fails, so Samuel anoints the second king, David. And David is a good king. Samuel dies, and then David's son Solomon takes over the kingdom. Solomon dies in what date? 931 BC. The kingdom splits, explosion. The northern kingdom is then called Israel. The southern kingdom is called Judah. There are how many tribes in the south? And in the north? 10. Good. And the king of the north is Jeroboam, and the king of the south is Rehoboam. Good. Just keep saying that with me and thinking it, and I'll do it in different orders so you make sure you learn it. Okay. So now we're in the period of the monarch, the divided monarchy. Now you've got north and south. And the reason it's split is because there's disobedience and there's problems, and they're continuing to grow. And so the northern kingdom departs more quickly from God and from Torah, from the instruction he gave them at Sinai, and they come under God's judgment through the Assyrians. You've got the A, B, C's of the captivity. They are Assyria, Babylon, Cyrus the Great, who's for the Medo-Persian king. So Nineveh is up here. The Ninevites come, and of course they came in a Fertile Crescent type of way. The Ninevites come, Assyria. They conquer the north in what date? 722 BC, and scatter them. The Babylonians conquer the south, Judah, in 586, and they deport them to Babylon. What historical book are we in? I haven't told you. You know? Okay. Here's what we have. We have 4 books of the Kings. Does your Bible have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Kings? Catholic Bible does. The Roman Catholic Bible has 4 kings. We have 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay? But you can basically think of those as the 4 books of the Kings. The first book, Samuel, is about Samuel, but it's only about Samuel until we get to the first king, Saul. So the first king is primarily about Saul. Okay? Now, David comes in the middle, but he's not the king until you get to the end of 1 Samuel. So the first book of Kings is 1 Samuel. The second book of the Kings is 2 Samuel, which is basically about David. The third book of the Kings is our 1 Kings in Protestant Bibles. Okay? And that's basically about, who would you guess? Solomon. Now, he dies before the end of 1 Kings. But roughly that's how you can find where you want to be for these guys. So Solomon in 1 Kings, all of the rest of the kings in 2 Kings, a few at the end of 1 Kings. Okay? So you got it? So the book of Saul is 1 Samuel. Well, there's little Samuel, so you can remember that, okay? The book of David is 2 Samuel, and Samuel's still involved with him, right? And then the book of Solomon is 1 Kings, and the rest of the kings are 2 Kings, all right? Good. So there's the next 4 historical books. So somebody says, well, let's go read about King Hezekiah. Where are you going to guess it is? 2 Kings, all right? Some of the early kings after Solomon will be at the end of 1 Kings, but you'll find them, all right? By the way, I'm not going to have you memorize the kings when we get there. Unless I find you're a particularly clever group, and then maybe we will. Oh, there's a catch-22. Okay, so the Babylonians come. They conquer the south, Judah, in what book? 2 Kings. And they go back to Babylon, back here. They're here for 70 years. All right, 70 years of bondage, 70 years. And then Cyrus conquers the Babylonians and allows them to come back in 3 waves. First wave led by Zerubbabel, clean up the rubble. Second wave led back by Ezra. What historical book? Ezra, good. By the way, what historical book is Zerubbabel in? Got to be Ezra. That's all that's left after Kings, isn't it? All right? Zerubbabel and Ezra are in Ezra, and the third wave led by Nehemiah, which is our last historical book. So there, you have all of that history in those books, and you can find where you want to read about it and know where you are. What do all together? They rebuild temple, rebuild the wall. The end of Revelation, Old Testament Revelation, written Revelation, you have 400 years, silence, birth of Christ. Good. Okay. We'll have an exam on that here someday, just a pop quiz. You know it. You know it. Any questions on just what we've done so far? Chris? No. No, you'll have to take a course on intertestamental period with Mr. Sanchez to do that. We will talk about, we'll brush against it when we get to Daniel chapter 11. But Daniel chapter 11 actually gives pretty specific prophecy that is fulfilled in that intertestamental period. But no, we will not cover that. It is important. It's important in understanding the transition in the New Testament, but not part of this course. Any other questions? Okay, I want to just start with thinking through Genesis. This would be page 10 of your notes. And if you do not have your note-taking outlines yet, you need to do that. See Mr. Rush. You absolutely need these. We noted that Genesis, as the designed to give Israel information as to who they were and why God was dealing with them as He was and what God had in store for them, also answers questions for all people. Information about who we are, we're personal creatures, why we're here, to exercise dominion. We'll talk more about that. What is the problem? We know there's a problem with life. It just doesn't work as we intuitively think it should. There are conundrums, and there's death, and there's pain, and suffering, and so much confusion. Well, we're rebels. We're under a curse. We need restoration. Where are we going? Well, God is in the process of bringing restoration to the whole creation and to us individually in salvation and in glorification. And how do we get there? Well, God has set about a plan to restore the original condition to the earth, to bring blessing. And we find all of that laid out in the book of Genesis. And we start with creation. Why does Genesis start with creation? Well, because it's the beginning. Yeah, but there's other reasons as well. And because they were having great debates in Egypt over evolution and creation? No, that's not why God had Moses pen Genesis. It's to learn about God. And that's the beginning point of learning about God, is creation. And so it is not given to us to have scientific debates about, though there are scientific issues that are involved in creation. It is given to us to teach us about God. That's why it was given to Israel. And that's what we want to see in terms of its immediate intent for them and its intent for us. First of all, the whole account of creation is to answer the question, who is Israel's God? When Moses is on the backside of the desert and God appears to him in the burning bush and says, I want you to go back to Egypt. What does he say? He says, they're not going to listen to me. Who am I going to say has sent me when they ask? And God goes into an explanation about who He is on the basis of His name. And that's a fundamental question. Moses understood that if Israel was going to follow him out of Egypt, they were going to have to be powerfully motivated. And that was going to have to begin, solely center in, an understanding of who God was. And so the account of Genesis is designed to give that information. And I would assume that God had given Moses that information, and that's one of the things that Moses would have been communicating to these people. That Israel's God is the eternal Creator. Now, how does that contrast to what you found about the gods as you read in Mesopotamian and Canaanite and Egyptian religion? Did you find differences? Did you consciously say, wow, that's a lot different? What did you find? Yeah. There you go. They're not eternal. They're destructible. And they're not separate from the creation. In some senses, they're part of it. And then you've got gods that are, gods of the storm, and then a different god is the god of, fertility, and a different god is the god of this. So you've got a really different view of the gods with respect to their relation to the material universe than you have in Genesis, don't you? And so right at the beginning, you find this completely different casting of the information about who the God of Israel is. He is the eternal creator, and we'll end with this, who does two things. He rules in history. So he isn't just up there, waiting for people to serve him and not concerned about what's going on. He is actually involved in the outworking of history. He is controlling the outworking of history. And he is one who relates to man, who relates to human beings on a personal basis. Is that how the gods of the Canaanites were? No. They were impersonal. They were removed. They did not care except to be served. And so what we find right at the beginning when it declares God created the heavens and the earth, and we go on through the first 2 chapters of Genesis, is that Israel is being told, you are the people of the unique God, the one supreme God, the God who really is, the God who is above all and responsible for all. And that's where all worldview needs to start, is with an understanding of who is really out there. It's the eternal God who rules history and who relates to man. And so that is how we will find creation cast. That is the immediate purpose of creation. It's not to say the issues of science are unimportant when it comes to creation with the debate that goes on in our culture. But that was not the reason for the giving of this information to Israel originally. It was to impress them with the person behind the creation.